I kept the document on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I told anyone. 3 weeks of making my morning coffee, looking at that envelope from the city of Ottawa, and just smiling. My neighbor Frank kept asking me why I seemed so calm lately. I told him it was the new brand of tea I'd been drinking. He didn't believe me. Frank never believes anything I say, which is probably why we've been friends for 31 years. My name is Martin. I'm 69 years old. I have a bad knee from a hockey injury in 1987, and I have lived in the same house on Elm Ridge Drive in Kanata for 26 years. My wife Carol and I bought it together when our daughter Angela was 7 years old. Carol passed 6 years ago breast cancer, fast and merciless, and after that, the house became something different to me. Not just walls and a roof. It became the last place where everything we built together still existed. Her garden in the back. The height marks she penciled on the kitchen door frame every birthday until Angela was 16. The way the afternoon light came through the front window at exactly 3 o'clock and made the hardwood floors look like honey. I was not going to lose that house. Not to anyone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Angela moved back in with me 4 years ago, in the autumn. She was 38. She had just married Derek, and she called me one Sunday evening with that particular tone she uses when she has already decided something and just needs me to agree. She said they were between places. Derek had just been made a junior partner at his firm in Ottawa, Rideau and Associates, corporate law, and they were waiting on approval for a condo downtown near the Glebe. She said it would be 60 days, maybe 90. She said, "Dad, it's just temporary. You have all that space." The house has 4 bedrooms. It's true. I was sleeping in one and using another as an office, and the other 2 had been sitting empty since Angela left for university in 2005. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. Carol would have wanted her there. 90 days became 6 months. 6 months became a year. The condo approval fell through something about financing. Derek was vague about the details and I didn't push, and then they were simply living with me. Derek had a way of expanding into whatever space he occupied. He moved the treadmill into the garage without asking. He rearranged the living room furniture because, as he put it, the old layout didn't flow properly. He started leaving his briefcase on the kitchen table in the mornings so that I had to move it to make room for my breakfast. Small things. The kind of thing you don't mention because each one alone seems too minor to raise, but they accumulate the way snow accumulates. One morning you wake up and you can't see the ground anymore. I want to be fair to Angela. She was working long hours at the hospital. She's a registered nurse at the Ottawa Hospital, Civic Campus, has been for 12 years, and I think when she came home she was too tired to notice. Or maybe she noticed and didn't know how to say anything. She had always found Derek difficult to argue with. He was the kind of man who treated every disagreement as a case to be won, and he was very good at winning cases. My friend Frank used to come over on Thursday evenings, and we would sit on the back porch and drink beer and watch the last of whatever light was left in the sky. Frank is 72, retired from Canada Post after 35 years, and he has the particular wisdom of a man who has outlasted most of his problems. He would listen to me talk about Derek and then he would say, "Martin, you're too polite. Always have been." And I would say that being polite wasn't the same as being a pushover. And Frank would just look at me over the rim of his bottle. He was right, of course. I was letting things slide that I shouldn't have been letting slide. The real trouble began 14 months in. On a Saturday in March, I came downstairs to find Derek sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and several printed documents spread in front of him. I poured myself coffee and asked what he was working on. He looked up and said, very casually, "Just doing some research on the property, the lot lines, assessment history, that kind of thing." I asked him why. He said he'd heard that the city was expanding the light rail corridor west of Kanata and that properties along that route were being rezoned for mixed commercial use. He said Elm Ridge Drive was in the zone. I didn't say anything. I stood there with my coffee and I listened. He said that a property like mine, large corner lot, half an acre, on the edge of the rezoning boundary, could be worth significantly more than the current residential assessment. He'd spoken to a colleague at work, he said, someone in real estate law. The colleague had run preliminary numbers. Derek looked at me the way he looked at everything steady, measured, already 3 steps ahead, and he said, "You should really think about what you're going to do with it, Martin." I said I was going to keep living in it. That was what I was going to do with it. He smiled. He had a particular smile that never quite reached his eyes. He said, "Of course. I just meant it might be worth making sure the ownership structure is optimized, tax implications and all that. At your age, estate planning matters." At your age. I finished my coffee and went upstairs and I called Frank. Frank said, "Martin, he's sniffing around your house." I said I thought I was overreacting. Frank said, "You are not overreacting. A corporate lawyer does not research your property assessment on a Saturday morning because he's bored." I lay awake that night thinking about what Derek had said. The rezoning, the ownership structure. I thought about the height marks on the kitchen door frame and the afternoon light on the hardwood floors. I thought about Carol's garden, which I had kept up every spring because it was the only thing that still felt like talking to her. The next morning I called my own lawyer. His name is Paul. He's been handling my affairs since Carol's estate, and he is the kind of person who speaks slowly and carefully and means every word. I told him what Derek had said. Paul was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Martin, I'm going to need you to come in." I went in on a Tuesday. Paul showed me the city documents he'd already pulled. He'd done his research before I arrived, which is why I trust him. The rezoning was real. The corridor expansion was confirmed. Properties within a certain boundary were reclassified as mixed-use commercial, and the corner lot on Elm Ridge Drive was, according to the updated assessment, now valued at just over $4 million. I sat in Paul's office and looked at that number. Paul said, "Your house has been worth $4 million for about 6 weeks. My guess is Derek found out before you did." I asked Paul what I needed to worry about. Paul said, "A few things. Has Derek ever asked you to add his name to the title, or Angela's?" I said no. He said, "Has he ever asked you to sign anything, any document at all?" I thought back. 3 weeks earlier, Derek had left a manila envelope on the kitchen table with a sticky note that said, "Dad forms for tax exemption on shared residence. Just routine, sign and date when you get a chance." I had picked it up, looked at the top page. It had a lot of legal language and a signature line, and set it back down. Something had made me uneasy. I had not signed it. I told Paul about the envelope. Paul said, "Bring it to me." I went home that afternoon. The envelope was still on the counter. I brought it to Paul the next day. Paul read it for a long time, and then he set it down, and he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. He said, "Martin, this is not a tax form. This is a partial transfer of beneficial interest in the property. If you had signed this, Derek would have had a legal claim to a share of the property value." I looked at him. He said, "He was hoping you wouldn't read it carefully. A lot of people don't." I drove home slowly. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a long time. I looked at the house, the front garden, the wooden shutters Carol and I had painted dark green the summer of 2003, the big maple in the yard that drops its keys every autumn and clogs the eaves troughs, and that I have never once thought about cutting down because Angela used to collect the keys as a child and try to stick them to her nose. I made a decision. I did not confront Derek. I did not say anything to Angela. I went back inside, put the unsigned envelope back on the counter exactly where it had been, and I asked Paul to help me do 3 things. First, to ensure the title of the property was registered clearly and solely in my name with no pending encumbrances. Second, to draft a proper will that outlined my wishes in unambiguous terms. Third, to advise me on my legal options if someone in my household attempted to pressure me regarding the property. Paul did all 3 things. It took about 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Derek became more attentive. He started asking questions about my health. How was my knee? Was I sleeping all right? Had I seen a doctor recently? He said more than once that he just wanted to make sure I was comfortable, that I wasn't under too much stress, that I knew he and Angela were there to take care of things. He said that at my age it was important not to have too much on my plate. At your age. There it was again. One evening, Angela came into the kitchen while I was making dinner. She sat at the table and looked at her hands and said, "Dad, Derek mentioned you might be thinking about simplifying things with the house." She looked uncomfortable. "He just wants to help. He knows property law. It's his area," and he thought. I said, "Angela, this is my home. Your mother and I bought this house together. I am not simplifying anything." She was quiet. Then she said, very quietly, "He said it might make more sense financially to restructure things before the rezoning is officially finalized." I turned around from the stove. I looked at my daughter. She couldn't meet my eyes. I said, Angela, look at me. She looked up. I said, do you want me out of this house? Her face crumpled. She said, Dad, no. That's not no. I would never. I said, then we don't need to have this conversation again. She nodded. She wiped her eyes. I went back to making dinner. That night, after they had gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen alone for a long time. I thought about what Frank had said, you're too polite, Martin. Always have been. I thought about the unsigned envelope. I thought about Derek's careful questions about my health, his casually mentioned colleague in real estate law, his Saturday morning research on my lot lines. I thought about a man who had been living in my house for 14 months, eating at my table, parking in my driveway, and who had been quietly, methodically building a case. I thought about Carol, about what she would have said. She would have said, Martin, you already know what to do. You've known for weeks. Stop waiting. The next morning I drove to a electronics store on Carling Avenue, and I bought a small digital voice recorder. It fit in my shirt pocket. I am 69 years old and I had never owned one before. And the young man at the store showed me how to use it with the patience of someone who teaches the same thing to older customers regularly and has decided to be kind about it. I started carrying it everywhere in the house. I want to be clear that I was not doing this out of spite or anger. I was doing it because Paul had told me that in Ontario, it is legal to record a conversation if you yourself are a participant in it. And I had begun to understand that I needed documentation, because Derek was a lawyer, and lawyers are careful, and if it ever came to a dispute, I would be a 69-year-old widower against a junior partner at Rito and Associates, and I needed something more than my word. 2 weeks later, Derek came into the living room on a Friday evening. Angela was working a night shift. It was just the two of us. He sat down across from me. I was reading, and he said, Martin, I think we need to have a frank conversation. I set down my book. The recorder was in my shirt pocket. I said, all right. He said he had reviewed the property timeline, and it was clear that the official rezoning designation would be finalized within the next 30 days. He said that once it was finalized, the property would attract significant interest from developers. He said that as things currently stood, I was going to face a substantial capital gains tax exposure if I sold, and that the only way to mitigate that was to restructure ownership before the finalization date. I said, and what would restructuring look like? He said he'd had his colleague draft a proper joint tenancy agreement. He said it was cleaner than the earlier version, more comprehensive. He said if I added Angela and himself to the title as joint tenants, and if we then handled the sale as a family trust, the tax savings could be significant. I said, and if I don't? He said, then you pay full capital gains on $4 million, Martin. That's roughly $1 million in tax. And frankly, at your age, that's not a position you want to be in. At your age. I looked at him. He was watching me with that steady, measured expression, waiting for me to feel afraid, waiting for the words at your age to land the way he'd intended them. I said, Derek, I want to make sure I understand. You're telling me that unless I add your name to my house, the house my wife and I bought together, the house I've lived in for 26 years, I will face a large tax bill. Is that correct? He said, I'm telling you there are better and worse ways to handle this situation. I said, and if I handle it the wrong way, what happens? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, I'm just trying to protect the family's interests, Martin. I said, I see. He left the room. I sat in the chair for a long time after that. Outside, the maple tree was starting to bud. The yard was that particular early spring green that only lasts about a week in Ottawa before the summer heat changes it. Carol had loved that week. She used to stand at the kitchen window with her coffee and say it was the best week of the year, and we were both always too busy to appreciate it properly. I appreciated it now. I called Frank the next morning. I said, Frank, I need a favor. Frank said, name it. I told him I needed him to come over for dinner on Sunday and that I needed him to be a witness to a conversation. Frank, who had been waiting patiently for 31 years for me to stop being too polite, said, finally. Sunday dinner was roast chicken. I made it the way Carol used to, with lemon and garlic and fresh thyme from the garden. Derek was in a good mood. He'd had a favorable week at work, apparently, and Angela looked tired but happy to be home. Frank sat at the table and ate 2 helpings, and made conversation about the hockey playoffs and the new construction on Highway 417. After dinner, when Angela had gone to start the dishes and Frank and I were still at the table, Derek leaned back in his chair and said, in what I had learned to recognize as his closing argument voice, "So Martin, have you given more thought to what we discussed?" I said I had. He said, "Good. I can have the new documents ready by end of week. My colleague has already—" I said, "Derek, I have some news about the property. I thought you should know." He went still. "What kind of news?" I reached into my jacket pocket and put the envelope on the table. The City of Ottawa envelope that had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks. I said, "The property was assessed at $4.2 million. That's correct. But I received this 3 weeks ago from the city. The rezoning boundary was revised in the final plan. Elm Ridge Drive was moved outside the mixed-use commercial zone." I paused. "My property is still residential. The value is the same as it was before, about $600,000. The room was very quiet. Derek looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He looked at Frank. He said, That's not possible." I reviewed the preliminary maps and I said, "Preliminary maps aren't final plans. Paul, my lawyer, has confirmed it. The revision was filed with the city 8 weeks ago." Derek's face went through several expressions very quickly. Confusion, recalculation, and then, finally, the one I had been waiting for. He realized what he had revealed. He realized what the past several months looked like in retrospect. A junior partner at a law firm in Ottawa had spent 14 months living in his father-in-law's house, researching the property assessment, drafting false tax documents, and pressuring a 69-year-old widower to sign over partial ownership for a windfall that did not exist. He said, very quietly, "I was trying to help the family." I said, "I have it on recording, Derek. Every conversation we've had about this property, the one in the living room 2 weeks ago, in particular. Paul has listened to it. He has some concerns about the document you asked me to sign 3 months ago, the one you called a tax exemption form." Frank was looking at the tablecloth. He was not smiling. He is a better man than that. Angela had come to the kitchen doorway. She was holding a dish towel. She was looking at her husband with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not anger, not surprise exactly, but something more like the moment when you finally see the shape of something you had been looking at for a long time without recognizing it. Derek said nothing. I said, "I'd like you to move out, both of you, though I want to be clear, Angela is welcome to stay as long as she needs to. That invitation stands. But you, Derek, I'd like you to be gone within 30 days. I'll put that in writing if you prefer." Derek stood up. He said something I won't repeat. He went upstairs. We heard drawers opening and closing. Angela sat down at the table. She put her face in her hands. I moved to the chair next to her. I put my hand on her back the way I used to when she was small and had woken from a bad dream. I said, "You didn't know." She said through her hands, "I should have known." I said, "You were tired. You were working nights and you were tired, and you trusted him. That's not a flaw, Angela. That's just who you are." She looked up. Her eyes were red. She said, "Dad, I am so sorry." I said, "I know you are." We sat at the table together while Frank poured himself another coffee and pretended to read the newspaper I'd left on the counter. From upstairs, we could hear Derek moving around. The maple tree in the yard was visible through the dining room window. Fully budded now, the early spring green that Carol had loved. I said to Angela quietly, "Your mother would want me to tell you that you're going to be all right." She started crying properly then. I let her. Derek left 4 days later. He and Angela separated formally 6 weeks after that. I know this because Angela told me herself, sitting in the kitchen one morning before her shift, drinking coffee. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she had always faced hard things directly, without drama. She said she had been unhappy for longer than she admitted to herself, and that the events of the past months had made certain things impossible to ignore. She said she had spoken to her own lawyer. I told her I was proud of her. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from her in months. She said, "Dad, I'm 42 years old. You don't have to be proud of me for getting a divorce." I said, "I can be proud of you for whatever I want. I'm your father." She shook her head, still smiling, and finished her coffee and went to work. Frank came over that Thursday. As always, we sat on the back porch, The spring was properly warm by then, and Carol's garden was coming up. I had planted the same flowers she always had, in the same beds, in the same order. Tulips along the fence, daffodils near the shed, the climbing roses on the trellis that I had repaired every autumn for 20 years. Frank looked out at the garden for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "You handled that well." I said, "You think so?" He said, "I think Carol would think so." We sat with that for a while. Frank had been there through everything, through Carol's illness, through the funeral, through the first winter alone when I had barely left the house. He had come over every Thursday without being asked, for 6 years. He never made it feel like charity. He just showed up. I said, "Frank, I've been thinking about the fishing cabin." Frank looked at me. I had inherited a small cabin from my brother up near Calabogie, 2 hours from Ottawa, on the lake. I had barely used it in years. I said, "I want to sign it over to you." Frank opened his mouth. I said, "Before you argue, you've been coming here every Thursday for 6 years. You shoveled my driveway the winter after Carol died without me asking. You drove me to Paul's office. You came to Sunday dinner without knowing you were going to be a witness to anything. You have been a better friend to me than I probably deserve, and I have a cabin I don't use, and you've always wanted to fish more, and so I'd like you to have it." Frank looked out at the garden. He said, "Martin, you don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to. That's the point." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "Okay?" He said, "I've been waiting for you to do something generous and impractical for 31 years. I'm not going to talk you out of it." We both laughed. It was the kind of laugh that meant something, the kind that takes a long time to get back once you've lost it, and I had been without it for 6 years. Angela stayed with me for another 2 months after Derek left. She needed time to find her own place, and I was glad for the company. Some mornings I would come downstairs and she would already be in the kitchen, and we would have coffee together before she left for her shift, and it was easy in a way it had not been since she was a teenager. She helped me repaint the living room a gray-green that Carol had once picked out and then abandoned in favor of yellow, and we had debated it in the kitchen for years, and I had finally decided it was time. When she moved into her own apartment, a nice one-bedroom in Westboro, close to the hospital, I helped her move boxes on a Saturday. Frank came too, and the 3 of us made 3 trips in Frank's truck, and Angela made us both lunch after, and it was a good day. A genuine good day. The last box we carried up was a small one. Inside it, Angela had packed 2 things from Elm Ridge Drive that I had told her to take. A photo of the 3 of us, Carol, Angela, and me from her university graduation, and the small wooden plaque that had hung above the kitchen sink at home, the one that said, "This is the place we chose," which Carol had found at a craft market in Merrickville years ago and which she had hung in every house we'd ever lived in. I had another one made. It's above my kitchen sink now. I still have my bad knee. I still make the same coffee every morning. The height marks are still on the kitchen door frame, and I've looked at them every day for 6 years, and I intend to keep doing so. I walk to Frank's house sometimes, in the evenings, just to have someone to talk to. He fishes at the Calabogie cabin most weekends now from May to September. He sends me photos. Occasionally he sends a fish. The maple tree drops its keys in the autumn and clogs the eaves troughs, and I get up on the ladder and clean them out, even with the bad knee, because Angela's name is still on that door frame at 4 feet 2 inches in Carol's handwriting, and that door frame is not going anywhere, and neither am I. Some people think that because you are 69, because you live alone, because your hair has gone gray and your knee makes noise on the stairs, you are past the age of consequences. They think you will be tired and confused and grateful for whatever help is offered. They think you will sign things without reading them. I've thought about that a lot. About how Derek sat at my kitchen table and used the words "at your age" like they were meant to soften something in me, to make me feel grateful that someone was paying attention. What he didn't understand, what I don't think he was capable of understanding, is that at my age, I have nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. Carol is gone, and I made my peace with that. Angela is safe and making her own way, and I am proud of her every single day. Frank is 72 and still driving to Calabogie and still winning at darts on Tuesday nights at the Royal Canadian Legion. I am 69 years old. I live in the house my wife and I chose together. The afternoon light still comes through the front window at 3 o'clock and lands on the hardwood floors. and it still looks like honey. I kept the document on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks, and then, when the time was right, I put it on the table.